Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, Rashid, and Matthew is in the booth. I got to bring him in right now before we have any technical difficulties as I was having and am having with my mouse and everything else. Hold on one second. Matthew, how are you doing today?
Hey Rashid, I'm doing okay. Let's hope the gods of Techne smile upon us.
Yeah, man, I'm glad to have you back here. For those of you who do not know, this is Matthew Everett. Tell them a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into the global divide.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm Matthew Errett. I'm a journalist. I wear a lot of hats, Rashid. So it's tough to decide where do I start. I've written a bunch of books. So I wrote a bunch of books on the untold history of Canada, the clash of the two Americas. My wife was a co-author of those. Um, I founded an organization or a platform called the Canadian Patriot Review to give Canadians a bit of a sense of what role they play within a broader chemistry, both historic and in the present. And I am the senior fellow of the American University in Moscow as well. So I do a few projects with those good people, and that's pretty much mostly what I do.
Since you brought up Moscow, there was a report this morning that Moscow struck, quote unquote, a depot of foreign or Western mercenaries. We know that's code for NATO, but and killed a lot of them after repelling a drone attack on Crimea. What is going on between the East and West, and why isn't the Empire listening or looking at reality? They're being defeated on the battlefield. They're being defeated in military weapons productions, and Russia has escalation domination on the European continent. Why are they so hell bent on forcing Russia's hand?
Well, it's difficult to put a stopper to change the trajectory of a machine that's in motion of the magnitude of the machine that's been created and deployed by the Anglo-American establishment over the course of many years. This didn't even emerge in 2014. Like this policy of dismantling Russia forever, undoing Russia as an existence, and expanding NATO to become a global military monopoly that has control over the nuclear first strikes, but also just a global force. This is something that goes back a very long time, really to the early days of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there has been, with that collapse, an intentional radicalization of the population of Ukraine. There were always sort of Nazi problems due to the fact that many of the leading Nazis and the most vicious killers of World War II, working with Stefan Bandera, represented by the likes of Mykola Lebed from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, Chrystia Freeland, our Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, and Justin Trudeau Handler has spoken proudly about her grandfather, who researchers have demonstrated was the key propagandist for Goebbels in Ukraine. So none of these figures were ever punished, and in fact went on as employees, in a sense, for the Anglo-American intelligence services after World War II. We know openly that Lebed worked directly for the CIA and was commissioned to recast a completely new narrative of World War II that would paint the Germans as the not so bad guys that we were kind of hoping to work with, and Russia and the Stalinists were recast to be the worse than Nazis. And so Mykola Lebed played the key role in what became several generations of high school of university textbooks of mythologies that nurtured and incubated successive generations of neo-Nazi fanatics who are like brainwashed zombies that gave rise to, in the early 90s, the Svoboda Party, an openly neo-Nazi organization under Oleg Tyanibok. And the thing about Ukraine is that they were something you could still ignore in the 80s because Ukraine had a really good economy, right? The quality of life was really good for your average Ukrainian. It was a tourist hotspot on the Black Sea. Like, everybody loved Ukraine. It was a energy abundance, food abundance, everything you could imagine, they had it. So it was very difficult radicalize or normalize this viciousness. But it was under the IMF controlled disintegration and shock therapy of the 90s that continued on for 30 years that created and again nurtured an oligarchical class overseen by people like Jeffrey Sachs and other IMF technocrats. They consciously created a new oligarchical class loyal to the West as house slaves, basically, but that would be viciously willing to destroy their own people and their own economy. And the people were consciously destroyed, resulting in a situation where you had a fertile soil for radicalization. That's always how this sort of terrorist fomentation works, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Syria, what doesn't matter. You got to destroy the economy first, give people a sense of generalized despair, and then you could get people to burn things down or do jihad or whatever. And in the case of the Ukrainian Nazi problem, it's a form of Aryan terrorism. And so, now we're several years into what began in 2014 with the Maidan as a war against Russia using proxies that are disposable in Ukraine. And I think that, honestly, those geopoliticians who were behind the original color revolution in 2004 that ousted a relatively sane Ukrainian government to bring in a more vicious pro-EU, pro-IMF, anti-Russian government and constitution, which Chrystia Freeland's mother helped draft that constitution in 2004. It was a George Soros color revolution. They did it again in 2014, right? Bringing in a much more pro-NATO, pro-EU, anti-Russian fanatic force that used a lot of these Nazis that this time came about under a new, more violent garb under the Azov Battalion and Pravi Sector and Right Sector and all of these things that were put to work to really just do hardcore murder and terrorism, which continued on for 8 years, in a war against those separatists, the pro-Russians living in the eastern part of Ukraine. And since Russia has come in, putting a stop to that in February of 2022, there were certain designs that had predicted the outcome that Russia was going to either collapse economically due to the sanctions that were supposed to annihilate the Russian ruble, cut them off of their ability to sell their vital resources to their European markets that formerly had purchased 60% of their energy from Russia. That was Europe before February 2022. And if that didn't happen, in fact, not only did Russia make up for all of that lost revenue by selling it at a discount to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, China, big time, India, many other buyers, but Europe is still getting it, and they're just paying a lot more because now these other buyers who are buying their excess oil from Russia are just selling it back to Europe that desperately needs something to stay warm and to not freeze to death or burn up in summertime. They're still buying it. Ultimately, it's still making its way to Europe, but through more expensive circuitous routes. And the other option that the oligarchy was going for in the West was kill Putin, encourage a fifth columnist rebellion within Moscow, and part of the withholding or the freezing of yachts and foreign assets that are held by a lot of these Russian oligarchs built up in the 1990s, who have been sort of just waiting to essentially take control or get revenge on Putin for having disrupted their flow when he took over from Yeltsin. Part of that freezing has been also an encouragement to them to say, well, look, the message has been, you want your yachts back, you want your villas on the French Riviera back, you want your assets in Rothschild banks to be unfrozen and given back to you. Okay, do what you got to do. Bring it back to the Yeltsin dynamic. Get rid of Putin and his nationalists, and they haven't been successful in any way. So I think that right now there is an intention to possibly eat a little bit of humble pie. So you're seeing some cracks where some of there does appear to be an effort to try to maybe change the momentum from, like I said, this machine is big, the public propaganda, the mass perception that the Ukrainians are these freedom fighters against these Nazi Russian orcs that should justify all of the money we've put in. This has been heavy, intensive, day-to-day propaganda. And now there's an effort. I think we see it with CNN recently putting out a bit of coverage on refugees from Ukraine and Russia, which actually paints Ukraine as the villain in that story. And that's CNN. That was this week, and that's weird and only explainable if you take it into context with a bunch of other things, right? There's been efforts to redirect the attention away from the actual U.S. and British controllers of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline blowout, which really became part of the public consciousness with Seymour Hersh's expose not that long ago. And the U.S. and forces from within the U.S. intelligence put out other narratives painting Ukraine as the actual bad guys, which is interesting that you have various things like that where at least a faction within the geopolitical planning groupings in the Pentagon and probably undoubtedly GCHQ in Britain have recognized that they need to like abort in a sense and try to like live to fight another day while still maintaining. You can't just do that black and white day to night. You have to sort of like transition out of it and find a new way to maybe focus on Taiwan increasingly, focus on Hungary, that you want to devote your resources to destabilizing, but they see that it's not really much of a win. And I think the recent leaks, which smell of limited hangout, right, that were released by this 21-year-old low-level figure in the U.S. military without very much security clearance. This guy was the one somehow who's being attributed to having like released this massive bounty of insider intelligence to the public. And there's a lot of truth in there, but there's also, I think, some fallacies and misinfo that have been consciously put in there as well to put out the idea that, no, in fact, Ukraine is not winning. We acknowledge that they're not really doing so good. And, like there's, I think, an effort to try to re-steer the machine. So that's how I'm looking at it right now. I might be wrong on some of that, but I think that's where it's going.